Welcome to Mythcrashers, a podcast where you don't need an invite to join us on a creative and usually irreverent ride through the stories we keep telling over and over. I'm Nicole. Thanks for tuning in.
I'm Malinda. Welcome. You don't need an invite, but it helps. It's always good to feel welcome. Today, we are here to discuss on our irreverent roller coaster through the myths of time, plants. Plant fan, Nicole?
I like a plant. I wouldn't say I'm a plant fan. I am do you have a green thumb, Malinda? I do not.
No, absolutely not. No. I feel it's weird because I moved to my new place about 6 months ago and I've got a much bigger room and I thought, oh, plants, and it's just not happened. The closest I've got is a Lego set of flowers, which I'm yet to put together. But that's about as green as this thumb is getting. I think, provided it's not, attacked by radiation or a leak or something. Angry parsley. But they're beautiful. They're beautiful.
Mm.
But I don't know. I would, in the choice between plant or like pet, I would go for pet. I would have a cat. Meow.
I am a cold-hearted person and would go for neither.
Neither?
I do not want to care for anything, Malinda.
You want to wander the halls like Miss Havisham?
Yes.
Hello.
That sounds excellent.
Without having to water or feed anything.
So I think today we're going to discuss people who turn into plants, though. So not just regular plants, special plants.
Oh, actual plants and people that turn into them, but not through like photosynthesis, as in they are turned into them by, say, some kind of Greek god, as that is sort of a theme I've heard on the grapevine. Plants, get me. So myths about plants. There is my knowledgeable friend Christine, who is still with us. Hey, let's say hello to the people, Christine.
I'm always here. I'm always lurking.
Good.
Yeah.
Who we refer to as Dr. Christine, the brain plasto. There is, am I right in thinking there is Daphne, who was turned into a laurel tree?
Yeah, so there's a whole load of stories in Greek mythology of people who get turned into various kinds of plants. One of them, you're right, is Daphne, who, she gets turned into a laurel tree. We have Narcissus, who gets turned into a narcissus. That clues in the name with that one. And there are other people too. There's a guy called Hyacinth or Hyacinthos who gets turned into a hyacinth, or possibly an iris. But yeah, lots of different people in Greek mythology and other world mythologies get turned into plants at some point. And it's weird.
Because there are quite a few like creation myths have a kind of like relationship of descent. Like I've come across like a Mayan creation myth, in which like the most successful kind of iteration of man was created from corn. So from what I'm aware, like a lot of Greek myths tend to use humans being turned into plants as a kind of like protective to like prevent death or to save them from something or someone, except in the case of Narcissus, right? Narcissus, I believe,
it kind of saves him from himself, doesn't it? Because otherwise he'd be staring at his own reflection for years and years and years, right? I guess I'd rather be a plant than stare at my own reflection for years and years and years.
Yeah, well, there's kind of different versions of why Narcissus maybe gets turned into a plant, but he maybe kind of, some people say that he kind of wastes away and just turns into a plant because he can't drag himself away from his own reflection by the pond. And so, I mean, that's clearly not something that happens to real people, but, it is a myth after all.
I actually think that's what happens to all of us, Chrissie.
Ah,
we die.
That's a lovely thought.
We become dirt. We become plants.
But then sometimes the the transformation of Narcissus. So Narcissus is kind of cursed to fall in love with himself. And then the transformation into a plant is maybe a kind of consolation prize, a sort of something that's meant to make up for the fact that he was cursed to fall in love with himself. It's a bit like Tiresias being made blind, but then being given the gift of prophecy to kind of like compensate for it. So but it's not like a great fate, I don't think, turning into a plant.
Well, the other option is turning into an animal, right? Which would you rather?
Animal. I think it's that. I think it always feels like there's a degree of cruelty with being turned into a plant because you lose that element of sentiency unless you're Grandmother Willow, in which you're both human and tree. It seems.
Maybe this is very Gen Z of me, but I would like to have no thoughts and be a plant.
This might be a dream. The story of Apollo and Daphne, in which you may find yourself actually probably not very jealous of Daphne. Because, so Apollo was in love with Daphne, who was a nymph. And then, as I recall, he kind of persuades Eros, Cupid, the man in the nappy, to like shoot Daphne. Was it to shoot Apollo? He shoots him with love's arrow, and then Daphne is like, no! Wasn't particularly interested in men because she was like a follower of Artemis, and just wanted to like chill in the forest, doing forest chilly things.
I've just written in my notes, is Daphne a lesbian?
That is possible. But then she's trying to escape him, and she calls out to her father, who's the river god, to save her and to like change her form in a very victim blamey way, because it's like, Dad, please change my form because it's definitely my beautiful face which is driving Apollo mad.
Yeah.
And so he turns her into a laurel tree. And then Apollo kind of, I don't know, is in some way still very drawn to her as a tree and embraces her in whatever form, euphemistic or not, that means. And then there's kind of this like semi-horrific situation in which she's not able to escape because she is now a laurel tree. And then Apollo goes one further by saying, actually, I'm going to make the laurel my symbol. Although in this particular instance, there's like a kind of sense again of like plants as protective, but also in this case, clearly not enough to like quite. I mean, I think it's like it's another classic garbage man on Apollo's half, but it's like, yeah, it's very interesting because it's not the only kind of, as Chrissie was saying about Narcissus, it's not the only instance in which a resolution is sought through turning somebody into a plant.
Well, I do think that Apollo is a garbage man in this one, but and I usually think Apollo is a garbage man, but in Hyacinthos, I thought it was pretty dreamy. In Hyacinthos, basically what happens is Apollo is in love with Hyacinthos, and Zephyrus wants him as well. And Hyacinthos gets hit with a discus and dies in Apollo's arms, basically. But not before Ovid says they were oiled up and hanging out together. But so I do actually feel bad for Apollo in that one. Hyacinthos dies in his arms, and then Apollo turns him into the hyacinth flower, or the iris, as Chrissie was saying. So he's maybe not 100% a garbage man. Maybe, I don't know.
I find because there is like this sense of plants, because they can be poisonous and because they kind of die at different seasons and things, there is this kind of sense that plants can be representative of death and decay.
So we have a guest with us today, and our guest today is David Bullen, who is a writer and theatre maker and academic. Welcome, David, to Mythcrashers.
Hi. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me join Mythcrashers.
Hello.
I'm excited to be here.
We actually sent you an invite. You don't need one though.
Yeah, I am crashing Mythcrashers. So here we go.
What is your feeling about the idea of kind of transformations into plants as like a kind of place of greater safety?
I think it's interesting to think about those reasons why those mortals are being turned into plants. I mean, in Ovid, there's a range of different scenarios, but like if you think about Daphne, there's this question of she's being turned into the plant to protect her, but is this also a kind of victim blamey kind of punishment that is happening to her? Are these people really being saved, or is this a kind of tacit punishment, but just of a different kind of order? Maybe. I mean, I think it's interesting. The hyacinthus one is the one that really intrigues me. I think there's something, I'm coming to this from this place that I wrote a play about Apollo and hyacinthus about many years ago when I was at university. It was just terrible. Let's be honest about it. It was just a terrible play because it was very sappy. It became very sappy to be sappy, I guess, is a plant pun there. Wow. But like it became very kind of like saccharine about gay relationships and how they're great, as a thing. With a kind of complete with a kind of tragic, it's so sad he dies, but he gets turned into a flower, which felt kind of suitably, to put, for lack of a better word, gay, for that, to my mind at the time. But it's a strange, it's quite a strange thing to be turned into a plant.
Why don't you tell us, David, about the angst of which the hyacinthus play emerged?
We don't need that.
No, you don't want to hear. That's not for public ears. No, I guess I think there's something interesting about when people get turned into flowers, particularly, and what that does in terms of the kind of gender. There's something interesting that hyacinthus is turned into a flower, and the way that kind of connects. I mean, for me, when I was writing that play, it felt like it was connecting quite genuinely with some of the rhetoric around, homophobic rhetoric around, gay men as pansies. He doesn't quite turn into a pansy, but he's close enough, I guess. It feels like there's something there about it. The man who's loved by another male god gets, his not punishment, but the outcome of his story is that he's made a flower, not a bird, not a beast of some kind. It's a little beautiful kind of aesthetic thing. And I don't know, there's something to me that says that kind of resonates with a particular way that we think in culture right now, UK culture right now, and have done, certainly 10 years ago, thinking about kind of effeminacy, homosexuality, that sort of thing.
All the flowers in Alice in Wonderland are absolute bitches.
Mm.
Yeah, there's some gay men. There's some drag rolls. The flowers in Alice in Wonderland.
They're just very mean to her. That's all. Yeah,
they are bitches. What is it about plants, about flowers that I'm interested about what we project onto the natural world, and features of the natural world. Like with animals, yes, okay. With both animals and plants, there's long-standing culturally, it differs obviously culture to culture, long-standing associations with those. With those features of the natural world. But with animals, you can kind of be like, okay, I can begin to understand how certain animals have developed certain kind of reputations with, cultural reputations or mythic reputations. But But like with plants, it's interesting that we kind of project something onto them, because all they are really is just, from our perspective, yes, we can see some of them are poisonous, some of them look nice, some of them, have certain kinds of features that might shape how we're thinking. But there is really a projection onto those plants, and I think those projections are gendered.
Can I ask? Are there any stories where people turn into poisonous plants, or is it always a nice thing? Is it always meant to be a nice thing? Sorry, totally different. I was just because David said poisonous plants. So
yeah, I'm thinking. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I don't claim to be Apollodorus's library. Sorry, that's a really niche reference to
Wow,
a Greek writer who noted down a whole load of myths.
What am I, Apollodorus's library?
Something that's interesting with poison is that poison, not only in the ancient world, is always associated with women, in a way that plants might be as well, because poison is always seen as a woman's weapon, because you don't need physical strength to use it to kill somebody. And obviously women have no physical strength. Duh.
I'm pro poisoning as a method of murder. We can make this a true crime podcast if you want.
A pro-crime podcast or a true crime podcast?
Bit of both.
I wonder whether that was why Agatha Christie was so hot on poison. She was just like, poison. Every single one, poison.
It's subtle, it's sly, and you can poison somebody without them knowing. It's very difficult to stab somebody without them knowing. And that's so... But then there's something there about kind of women being dangerous and also monstrous, and then kind of, if they're flowers as well, then there's something monstrous about that in a way, although it's a beautiful monstrousness, maybe. But
I was thinking about with the Apollo Hyacinthos thing, it's the subject of Mozart's first opera that he wrote when he was only like 10, 11, or maybe it's not his first opera, but, at 10 and 11, I hope it's an early one. But, but it's a very sanitized version in terms of the representation of homosexuality. I think he invents or a sister or something for him, or the librettist invents a sister for Hyacinthos, so Apollo could be in love with the sister, but still Hyacinthos is the one that gets turned into the plant, I guess. And I think there's something interesting about. I guess I'm really interested in about the way that this particular story that has a homosexual dimension it features someone being turned into a plant rather than turned into an animal. I think there's something interesting, the way that maps onto our kind of understanding around gender and sexuality.
We had mentioned in our pre-show chat that there aren't really that many modern versions of turning into plant stories, that most modern versions are turning into animal stories. Why do you think that is?
I guess I was racking my brains trying to think before coming on this podcast about exactly that. What modern examples do we have of people being turned into plants? And the best one I can think of is actually the Batman villain Poison Ivy, immortally committed to the silver screen by Uma Thurman in the 1997's Batman and Robin. A true masterpiece of cinema. All are agreed. I don't think there's any dissent there amongst critics, or indeed fans. But she's an interesting character, really popular Batman character, and of course she's turned into not a plant exactly, but she kind of becomes a living embodiment of poisonous plants. And I think there's some that you can see lots of kind of. Well, I was mentioning earlier about the way that the Hyacinthos story kind of speaks to or resonates with certain conceptions we have around gender and sexuality. And I think that Poison Ivy is similar. She is sort of the fact that she's turned into this plant-like creature enables her to be sexy, enables her to be dangerous because of the poison, enables her to kind of take on a range of kind of gendered stereotypes that become, that kind of align with her association with, the kind of plant world.
And there was something I was thinking about which was interesting. Nicole said something earlier about like wanting to have no thoughts, basically. And I think, I wonder sometimes if that's kind of why maybe these plant stories, plant transformations don't appeal to the modern sensibility maybe as much as they did to the ancient sensibility. Or, I mean, I can't speak for what ancient people thought, obviously. But there's something about being turned into a plant that is quite, well, I was going to say dehumanizing. Obviously, it's dehumanizing. It's literally dehumanizing. But I think it's easier for us to imagine that animals have some kind of conscious experience of the world and that they might have emotions or reactions or feelings or something like this. Because, I suppose there are people who like dogs more than cats, and I think those people are strange. But I guess those people look at their dog and like see that the dog is happy or sad or whatever. I look at my spider plants and I don't know whether they're happy or sad or experiencing the world in any way that is comparable to my experience of the world. And I think maybe it's quite scary to think that that would be your reward, is going to a state of being where your perception of existence is entirely different. And maybe that doesn't seem like a very satisfying end to a story to us anymore. But I wonder why it was satisfying in Greek mythology. Maybe it never was. Maybe it's not meant to be satisfying.
Well, is it less scary than dying? Is the idea of becoming a tree forever less scary than dying? Or is it a fate worse than death?
Didn't Gaia turn her son, her Titan son, into a fig tree to protect him from being killed in the big battle between the Titans and the gods? And so I kind of always assumed in that context that being turned into a plant or some kind of vegetation was better than death, or maybe a very particular kind of death.
I think there's something interesting about altered consciousness. And I guess when you imagine that when we have stories in which people turn into animals, we kind of, while we don't necessarily imagine that animals always have the same kind of cognitive processes, we don't imagine that animals think exactly like humans. They're close enough, right? Like they have a consciousness that is close enough to human consciousness, and we think that when we have pets, I know I do this with my dog all the time. You project human thoughts onto that dog, and kind of imagine that they think in the same way as humans do. And I think that's a fairly common thing, and it's sort of viable with animals. But with plants, you just can't do that. It's a totally different way of conceiving what it is to be alive. And I think that may be what associated with this idea we're talking about here around, is this better than death? It's like it's a completely different way of existing, that where kind of consciousness is not conceived of in the same terms as animalistic kind of consciousness. And I guess maybe that's something that maybe interested ancient Greeks and Romans. Maybe that was part of the kind of appeal or the lure there. And maybe that doesn't necessarily interest us very much in the present, where the present seems to be very interested around kind of consciousness in a kind of anthropomorphic sense, kind of the individual, consciousness as kind of framed around an individual's sense of self and whatever. And actually, to what extent would you lose that? I don't know if you could, like, do plants, are they capable of being able to articulate the self? Do you know what I mean? And perhaps that idea is difficult for us in a very kind of individualized present to kind of get our heads around. And so maybe it's more appealing to, you could anthropomorphize animals easier. Do you know what I mean?
Here's a fun one. If you were going to turn into any plant, what plant would you turn into?
I'd like to be a nice tree.
Yeah, I'm leaning more towards a tree than a flower. I feel like a flower is easily crushed. Whereas a tree is like very, I'm going to just stand here.
So I teach at Royal Holloway in the drama department, and behind the drama department, we have an arboretum. And there are a whole range of really rare trees in that arboretum. And I was doing some work in there today with some students. One of my classes are kind of creating a performance in that arboretum. I was looking at the trees and I was just like, you're great, you know, like you're really great. Like there's something really kind of awe-inspiring about trees, particularly trees of a certain kind of scale. I think if I had to be a plant, I would definitely want to I want to be like one of those trees, you know, like you're an ecosystem, you know, like beat that.
I strongly recommend everyone reads The Overstory by Richard Powers, which is a great novel about trees.
Is it in Apollodorus's library?
Shut up.
Oh, actually, I have a similar recommendation, which I'm nicking from you, Chrissie, from our pre-show chat. Silvia Moreno Garcia's Mexican Gothic, which I read based on your recommendation. And that is, I don't want to give spoilers, but that is interested in plants and types of consciousness associated with, it's not plants, but fungi in that instance. But I think that's a really interesting sort of sci-fi, magical, realist kind of approach to thinking about that. Interesting that was that a novel that you recommended, Chrissie?
Yes. Well, I think there's parts of it that are based on true events, historical events, but it's a story about trees. Basically, I think it's about 9 different people whose lives are impacted by trees in different ways, and then there are sort of interesting connections between the people. It's quite long, and it gets quite scientific at some points about it was actually fascinating to read, not only because I enjoyed it as a novel, but because I learned all kinds of things about trees, like how they communicate with each other and warn each other of things like disease and pests entering the forest or area where all the different trees are, and that they can share resources through different root systems. They can feed each other and all kinds of incredible things that trees can do. And it was eye-opening and also just a really enjoyable book.
What a model for civilization. We should all be more like trees. But I was really interested in the fact that both of us then recommended novels, right? What is it? I wonder if this is a thing. This is a very unacademic, unstudied comment, but I wonder if there's something about the form of the novel that enables a kind of plant transformation story or that kind of thing. Not that you were suggesting that was a plant transformation story, but do you know what I mean? It's something, the way that maybe the novel is able to engage with some of the qualities we associate with plants, which might be more, I don't want to say passive, but more meditative perhaps than say film or theatre, which might be less interested in doing that because, and focused on more animal-based stories because, that's more kind of visually active, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I think it's certainly more possible to tell a first-person plant story in a book than in a movie. But we were talking about probably the most famous modern version of a anthropomorphized plant is The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein, which I'm sure many of our listeners are aware of. This children's book about a tree that gives all that it can give before giving its, I don't know what, giving the wood.
A tree that gives you wood.
Please.
Have you not read The Giving? Have you not read The Giving Tree?
I have not read The Giving Tree.
Are you serious?
No, I have no idea what anyone is.
Does nobody know what the Giving Tree is?
I know what the Giving... So the Giving Tree is a bit like the rainbow fish that gives away all of its rainbow scales, except it has a much sadder ending where essentially the tree gives itself its own life, the wood that it is made of, for somebody else's use. I believe the tree is a metaphor for your mother, like not your mother, Nicole, but one's mother as kind of a... all self-sacrificing figure, which is also interesting. I mean, that's one interpretation I've heard anyway. Nicole, correct me if I'm wrong, but the people who the Giving Tree gives itself to are not very grateful, are they?
I don't know if that's like a major plot. Basically what happens is the kid grows up and she allows him to hack the tree down, or I don't even know if the tree is feminized, but the tree gets hacked down and the kid uses it to, the adult now uses it to build a house. And then when the tree is just a stump, the old man sits on the stump. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the morals of the Giving Tree.
It's still a nice story. I mean, or a complicated story, I guess, for children.
I think a really interesting example from the last 20 years of pop culture and longer, if we want to think about it in terms of the book, are the Ents from Lord of the Rings. I'm thinking about it particularly in relation to the film, but yes, okay, you could take that further in terms of the book or the film adaptations. But that they are, or certainly in that film, they're kind of represented as a living tree, a kind of human tree. And I think that the film kind of gives them more action than they necessarily kind of get in the books. Well, they do the same kind of overall plot, but even in the film, they make a joke about the fact that the trees take ages to say hello to each other. And I think maybe that speaks to some of the things we were saying about, or I was saying about the trees and plants don't necessarily make for the most riveting action-based narratives, because they operate on a different kind of rhythm, different kind of scale to human lives.
One thing that I think is interesting, we've talked about how plants don't convey a lot of action, maybe, but what they maybe do is they make good metaphors, probably plants. And a lot of the stories that we've talked about today come from Ovid, who's obviously a Roman poet, who is a Roman poet writing in Latin. And he's very creative with his language. He's known to be kind of trying to be elusive and create imagery and things like this. And at the risk of being really obnoxious, I've been thinking about how we've talked a bit about how plants maybe have a different type of consciousness than humans and animals. And they also have a very different experience of time. So like a tree can live for hundreds of years. And that's quite a normal lifespan for a tree. And it made me think about myths, because the myths that we've talked about have been circulating for thousands of years, not just hundreds of years. And they kind of change shape and grow, and bits get cut off and new branches come out, and maybe they bloom, or, it's a tree metaphor. It's all just a tree metaphor. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. I'm just quite fascinated by the scientific fact of plants and vegetation being so fundamentally life prolonging and good and preventative, and just in every way just being having an ability to be quite a powerful force within human bodies. And I don't know whether I can only assume that there was a degree of, I guess, understanding of that. I mean, obviously not to the extent that we know now, that we can literally count and name all of the vitamins and minerals in plants and vegetation that are exactly good for us and in exactly what way. But I guess I don't know whether, again, it comes back to just an intuitive sense about death and life. The fact that, you know, when we die, we are buried in the earth, and then plants kind of grow from the earth, and that plants are essential for human life to survive. And there have kind of been studies that have shown a degree of horizontal, like, gene transfer that suggests that over the course of human evolution, we have sort of acquired certain bacterial genes and genes from plant life. And so there is kind of, I don't know, I'm fascinated by the idea that all of this kind of relationship is, possibly just born from something so intuitive that has actually been proven extensively over many, many centuries to have been scientific fact.
I was thinking about actually how this related back to when we were talking about Demeter in another episode, and kind of the importance of the relationship with the land and the relationship with nature. And maybe, you know, we kind of lose that in the modern world slightly. I mean, okay, I have too many houseplants, like a true millennial, but a lot of us don't have gardens and things like this, and don't get to work with the soil in the way that maybe a lot of ancient people did, or even relied on working with nature in order to survive. So nature can be quite harsh in that way, but it can also be, as Malinda said, it's the source of life. We need it to live because we need crops to eat, or crops to feed animals that we eat, or medicines, or even just to sort of beautify things, flowers and things like this. It's an important relationship.
I think it's interesting that most of the main myths surrounding this the people are transformed into delicate things, into meditative flowers, and it's not like people become tomato plants, you know. They become like the elegant parts of nature, the parts that we as humans enjoy. So it does seem to be more of a reward rather than, or at least not a punishment. Even though it's, in some cases, it's meant to be a punishment, it doesn't feel like a punishment necessarily.
Well, that's an interesting point. You know, do we think these are punishments? We've talked a bit about the transformation of Daphne as a sort of escape for her, or a refuge. And then we've talked about how maybe Narcissus, it's kind of a consolation prize. And for Hyacinthus as well, he's sort of, that's kind of a consolation prize for Apollo more than anything. But it's interesting. None of these, it's never quite a reward or a punishment, I don't think.
No, it is very neutral, which is weird for Greek myth, I feel.
Yeah. It's also, you know, I think that's also why it maybe doesn't translate to modern versions so much, is because it's kind of an unsatisfying ending to a story. Yeah. And then she turned into a tree.
It would be a satisfying ending for me, though. Please turn me into a tree.
That's it for this episode of Mythcrashers. Thanks for listening. Mythcrashers is a podcast from By Jove Theatre Company, presented by Nicole Savin and Melinda Smith, produced by Christine Plasto, with audio editing by Alex Burnett. We're grateful to the Open University and our supporters on Patreon for supporting this project. If you'd like to support By Jove Theatre Company and hear some behind-the-scenes clips from this podcast, go to patreon.com/byjove. You can also find us on Twitter @ByJoveTheatre, on Facebook @ByJove Theatre Company, or on our website at byjovetheatre.org.